All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and depending on where you're joining us from. As we are focusing on building gender-sensitive infrastructure for digital payment fraud prevention in West Africa, allow me to greet you with the various languages of West Africa. So Akwabo, Akwaba, Ekaro, No, Barka de Zua, Fonge, and Salam Alaikum. It's an honor to welcome you to this pivotal session on gender-disaggregated data and its role in preventing fraud within the digital payment ecosystem, particularly for women. My name is Lele Balde Cameron, and I have the pleasure of taking you through today's session. So as we know, digital payments have revolutionized financial access across the globe, including in our dear continent of Africa. Financial services and digital payments specifically have opened doors to economic empowerment, financial independence, as well as inclusion. However, while we can celebrate about that, the progress has also introduced many new vulnerabilities, particularly for women. Women are disproportionately targeted by fraudsters due to systemic inequalities, including lower digital literacy levels and limited access to secure financial tools. While digital tools and platforms are expanding their reach, they often lack critical gender-sensitive safeguards, leaving women exposed and at risk. One of the key reasons for these gaps include the lack of gender-disaggregated data. Without it, financial institutions and policymakers cannot fully understand the experiences of women in the digital economy. So today, myself and our esteemed panelists will address this gap. We'll explore how we can strengthen fraud prevention, how we can enhance financial literacy for women, and drive sustainable, inclusive financial ecosystems. So I'd like to introduce our wonderful panelists, and hoping that you're all on camera. Please do wave to us as I introduce you. So I'll start with Sonia Arenaza, who is a senior consultant at CGAP in digital finance. CGAP is a global partnership housed at the World Bank. With vast experience launching innovative financial products powered by blockchain, artificial intelligence, and digital finance, she has collaborated with global institutions like the UN, major banks, and tech firms. Her perspective on leveraging cutting-edge technologies to improve financial systems will provide invaluable insights into global best practices and gender-sensitive fraud prevention. Sonia, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Next, Dr. Neka Okekaru, please do wave, serves as the director of the Enterprise Development Center at the Pan-Atlantic University here in Lagos. Over the past 25 years, she has empowered countless entrepreneurs through initiatives like the Goldman Sachs 10,000 Women Program, the MasterCard Foundation, Transforming Nigeria Youth Project. Her expertise in gender, entrepreneurship, and sustainability uniquely positions her to discuss the intersection of financial inclusion, women-led businesses, and the impacts of fraud. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Dr. Neka Okekaru. And last but definitely not least is Emezino Afiegbe, also known as Zino, who is a Gender Center of Excellence lead at EFINA, also known as Enhancing Financial Innovation and Access. With more than 2 decades of experience in digital payments and financial inclusion, Zino has held leadership positions at Visa and top-tier financial institutions. He is passionate about enabling women to thrive financially through gender-sensitive solutions, making his perspective on tackling fraud within the African context especially critical. So a warm welcome to my panelists. Very happy to have you all with us. As our session will go on, each of our panelists will share their respective perspectives. We'll then go into a moderated discussion. And finally, we'll open the floor for audience questions. So please make sure to put your questions in the Q&A, and I'll make sure that we get to them at the end. So let's begin with Sonia Arenaza, who will provide a global perspective on how gender disaggregated data is being leveraged to combat fraud in digital payments. So Sonia, I'm happy to have introduced you, and you have lots of experience when it comes to the global perspective. So I'd like to use that perspective to kick us off, and then I'll move to Zeno for the Africa and West Africa perspective. So from a global perspective, what types of fraud are women particularly vulnerable to within the digital finance ecosystem, and how can financial systems be adapted to specifically address these vulnerabilities?
Well, thank you so much. Let me start with women are vulnerable to various types of fraud within digital finance due to many factors, being the three key most important: economic, socioeconomic, cultural, and technological factors, which can be amplified by disparities in digital finance as access to technology and gender-specific financial behavior. So we consider that addressing these vulnerabilities requires gender-friendly and tailored approaches to financial systems. Evidence, as we all have seen, shows that women are more likely to be affected by financial fraud. From a global perspective, I would like to touch upon three key types of fraud that women face: phishing and social engineering attacks, mobile money fraud and unauthorized transactions, and credit scams and predatory lending. So if I could talk about a little bit about them, on the phishing and social engineering attacks, women, especially in developing countries, are often targeted by fraudsters through phishing schemes that exploit personal information such as identity theft or financial fraud. Just as evidence, social engineering attacks have increased 320% year by year, according to World Metrics. And CGAP's research indicates that women are more susceptible to cyber fraud and social engineering scams like SMS and voice phishing. So we consider that financial systems should introduce robust user authentication, like the multi-factor authentication, and educate women. Women should be educated on recognizing phishing attacks and the risks of sharing their information. On the second one, on mobile money fraud and unauthorized transactions, we know that women, especially in rural and low-income areas, use mobile money as their day-to-day transaction tools for digital payments, making them target for fraud like unauthorized access, SIM card swaps, or fraudulent mobile money agents. So financial systems should provide mobile security like PIN, biometric verification, and also mobile platforms should provide transaction alerts. On the last one, on credit scams and predatory lending, sometimes women are forced or are enticed to take fraudulent products. So we advocate for accessible, transparent product options with clear terms and conditions. Overall, we consider that financial systems can address these vulnerabilities by some of the measures that I mentioned, but also by data privacy and protection, a strong gender-aware consumer protection frameworks, gender-sensitive customer support, and inclusive product designs that cover women's specific needs, behaviors, and preferences.
Thank you so much, Sonia. I think that sets the tone quite well for the rest of the conversation. And it sounds like financial education and awareness and literacy is at the core of everything that you have highlighted. So next, I'd like to move on to Zeno. Zeno, you and Efina are responsible for a lot of the data that's coming out of West Africa and Nigeria, specifically when it comes to financial inclusion. Your work at the Gender Center of Excellence also highlights the importance of focusing on women's financial inclusion. So from an Africa-wide West Africa perspective, what unique fraud patterns have you observed in Nigeria or West Africa that disproportionately affect women? And how can this data be used to develop targeted interventions? Thank you.
Thank you, Lily, and thanks to the Alliance for Innovative regulation for this opportunity to create awareness. Incidentally, today's conference is in the International Fraud Awareness Week, so it's so situated perfectly. And I really would piggyback a bit on what Sonia has shared, because in Nigeria, what we have seen when we carried out our survey is that where you have 111 million adults in Nigeria, and about 51% are women, which is about 56.6 million adults above 18 years of age. What that tells you immediately is that you have almost 50% of the opportunity not being fully harnessed by the financial services ecosystem. And you also have proportionally 50% of the same kinds of challenges and vulnerabilities being faced by women in Nigeria. So fraud, as it affects men, also affects women in Nigeria. And when we look at the data, one thing which we have seen, and of course, to get a full picture of what's going on in Nigeria with regard to fraud, is not just EFINA's data that will be relevant, but also other key parties like NIPS. So when you look at the NIPS report, for example, you will see that just within 2024, the first and second quarters of this year, there has been a marginal increase in the count of fraud, but a significant growth in the volume, the value of fraud. Now, the next question would be, what are the types of fraud we are seeing, particularly affecting women? So just as Sonia has shared, we have seen in Nigeria, predatory lending is a concern that has further diminished the limited trust levels that women have in the formal financial services space. And then we've also seen social engineering being leveraged. One thing which our conversations with people on the last mile when we carry out our research has revealed is what is very commonplace with the popular messaging platforms like WhatsApp, Telegram, and others, where people are able to use certain measures technically to break into an individual's profile or hack into an individual's profile and then have access to the contacts of the woman, and then now start outreach to the various persons on the contact list, claiming to be in need of certain amounts of money that need to be sent to a specific destination account. And people on the contact list, assuming that it's the woman who owns the account sending the message, quickly send the monies before calling to ask, were you the one who sent that message? So social engineering, we've seen a whole lot of that picking up over the last 12 months. And then something which is a concern, particularly because we're looking at financial inclusion for women in the hinterland and the rural areas, is fraud at agent locations. So when individuals go to agents in the rural areas and maybe they have a debit card and they just hand over the debit card to the operator without paying attention to how that card is being used. They might not even pay attention to whether the amount being withdrawn from the account is more than what they had requested should be transferred to a beneficiary. And in that way, they lose some of their monies. And one thing which an agent could say to absorb himself or herself from blame is to say that, well, I did give you the point of sale device to type in your approval, your PIN, and you typed in your PIN. So you must have checked what was being debited. Those who are vigilant to see prevent that type of fraud from occurring, but in many cases, persons do not. And that creates some challenges. So those three types of fraud are top of the list, where you have your social engineering, predatory lending, and also fraud at agent locations. One of the things we do at EFINA is go out into the field. And when we went to a popular open market in Lagos, we encountered some women who were selling fruits who said they don't want to get into the formal financial services space to obtain loans because of lack of trust, high incidence of fraud. So it is indeed a similar situation with the global picture, but with the nuance of the agent location frauds being an area to pay attention to.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much, Emezino, for that. Definitely lots to think about. I think, practically speaking, the examples you gave probably resonate with a lot of people who live in West Africa. I've also heard of fraud that happens specifically to women from their partners. So if their partners have access to their phones, they then start to, start transacting on their accounts with no consent from the woman. And because our society is quite patriarchal, women often don't have the right to say no. So as we know, the financial inclusion ecosystem is varied. We have different stakeholders, academia being one of them. So Dr. Neka, if I could come to you, based on your research, how does the lack of gender disaggregated data on fraud impact the financial resilience of women, particularly female entrepreneurs?
Thank you very much, Leila, and thank you so much for this platform to put a spotlight on something that is critical, but oftentimes ignored. So I'm going to be speaking from the Enterprise Women Center's perspective, having been around for 20 plus years working with entrepreneurs. And what we're seeing is that we do know that in Nigeria, that women own over 41% of the enterprises. And what we see is that where there's a lack of gender disaggregated data on fraud, it significantly affects their financial resilience. For female entrepreneurs, we know that they often face fraud risk due to the circumstances where they find themselves. So like Zino mentioned, and Sonia talking about the online payment scams, the predatory loan schemes. But digital fraud targeting women using mobile money platforms, especially in informal sectors, continues to be underreported due to insufficient gender-specific data. And what we see is that with this data gap, it limits the policymakers and the financial institutions from designing targeted interventions. That's the first thing. And what this does is that it leaves the women open to exploitation. Now, without detailed data, a lot of the financial fraud mitigation strategies remain generic. And we know that if it remains generic, there is no way we'll address the specific challenges that they face. Now, I want to give an example using Amina, a tailor in Kano, who runs a small business selling custom-made clothing. So Amina recently lost her savings to a fraudulent loan scheme targeting women in informal businesses. Unfortunately, Amina's case and the likes of Ngozi in Onitsha, the likes of Ejiro in Warri, the likes of Tofumi in Lagos will go undocumented because financial fraud data in Nigeria rarely considers gender. When women-specific fraud isn't adequately captured, what we see that it leaves these women vulnerable, often forcing them to deplete their own personal resources. And, what's off, that typically can happen. They shut down the businesses. So the absence of targeted data makes it difficult for a lot of the financial institutions to design products that can protect the women from such scams, leaving them exposed to repeated losses. Now, when that happens, definitely it's going to stifle their resilience and ultimately their own personal economic independence. And I think that a lot of the financial institutions, there's so much that can be done from a communication perspective as well that isn't happening. And I don't want to shake the table too much, but from stories we're hearing from the women who go through these fraud schemes and things, there's a lot of suspicion about what's happening internally in the financial institutions. And so they should do more. Fingers are being pointed. But like I said, it's a bit too early. It's not yet 12 noon to rock the table.
I was gonna say, please shake the table. This is the space to do it, but no.
Zino is smiling, so he knows what I'm talking about, right, Zino?
So I think those are, thank you so much, Dr. Neka, for those very insightful points. I think that's a valid point that you made in terms of some of the vulnerabilities that may be coming from various areas. I'm glad that you mentioned Amina, Ngozi, Ejiro, that are people that represent some of the numbers that we often talk about at such a high level. So if I could just follow up on some of the points that you made before I come to you, Sonia, and actually try and see before we move on if any of the speakers would like to comment on what anybody else has said. What's the role of educational institutions such as yours to support gender-specific data collection efforts to educate stakeholders on fraud prevention. You mentioned that the banks often don't communicate in a way that these customers understand. So I'd love to get your perspective from an educational role in closing these gaps. That's for you, Dr. Neka.
I'm sorry, my internet is a bit choppy, so I kind of lost the last 15 seconds, which is why I'm just putting my video off. What did you say?
What can academic institutions do to support gender-specific data collection efforts and educate stakeholders on fraud prevention?
Okay. So there's actually a lot that can be done. And that umbrella, I would put it under the collaboration umbrella, right? So so academic institutions can make a huge difference here and partner with various organizations, both public and private. So from the public sector, um, collaborating with the Small Medium Enterprise Women's Agencies of Nigeria, partnering with Zeno and his team, collaborating with the organizations such as the NECA, Network of Entrepreneurial Women, and WINBIS to gather and analyze gender-specific fraud data. Having that kind of collaborative effort means that we've really thrown the net far and wide, and we're able to get specific data. And they can even organize field surveys, focus groups in rural and urban areas. So, that way we're able to understand the nuances of how fraud affects women differently. Okay. Additionally, another thing that can be done, and I think when Sonia spoke and Zeno, and you also, highlighted that a little bit later, is the fact that financial literacy is a key factor. Financial literacy is not something that we talk about. More often than not, a lot of these entrepreneurs don't even know that financial literacy exists till they're well into their 20s, 30s, 40s, and in some instances, they never even get to understand financial literacy. So we can start to think about integrating specific gender-sensitive financial literacy into different curricula, into different programs that they have across board for women, for young women, for mid-age women. And that way, but the earlier we do that, the better. So we're able to do that as students. We're equipping the students with the tools so they can analyze and they can address some of these challenges. Universities also can serve as intermediaries between women entrepreneurs and financial service providers, thereby fostering trust and encouraging reporting of fraud incidents, as well as a lot of awareness programs and workshops and conferences. So something like what we're doing today, but this is slightly high level. There's a way that this can sort of filter down to the way that they'll be able to understand and the impact it can make in their lives. And so working with banks, fintech, startups, NGOs would help us develop fraud prevention strategies that are tailored to them. So imagine if institutions are able to incorporate these findings into various entrepreneurship training programs for women. An example would be hosting a workshop for female small business owners, market women in Lagos, in Port Harcourt, in the major cities, in Nairobi, in Accra. Thereby, certain platforms that could teach these women how to recognize fraud attempts and then be more proactive rather than reactive. I think if we looked at it from that perspective, definitely we can sort of start closing those gaps.
Thank you. No, definitely the collaborative approach between ecosystem stakeholders is definitely encouraged. And I'm glad that we have various stakeholders on this call. Sonia, are there any successful models or case studies from other regions apart from West Africa that can serve as frameworks for improving fraud prevention strategies in West Africa, particularly for women?
Yes, what I can mention here is, like, as Dr. Neka and Zeno mentioned, we consider that implementing gender-sensitive fraud prevention strategies is crucial for enhancing financial inclusion and security for women in emerging markets, especially in West Africa. I would like to emphasize the importance of supply-side gender-disaggregated data. Just to clarify, we have on the gender-disaggregated data, we have the demand side, which is the needs and the opinions and the perceptions of the users in the market. But on the supply side, we also know the behavior of the market, the financial providers. So to emphasize that on the SGDD side of the supply gender disaggregated data, it's important to inform policies, guidance, products, and risk management to benefit financial supervisory authorities, providers, and most importantly, women's financial inclusion and agency. CGAP's research shows that while steps have been taken on the collection of demand GDD, today there is no ideal set of standards or best practices that have emerged for collecting and using the supply side of the data. The motivation of countries have gone on the supply side varies. For instance, some countries have a strong culture of data-driven evidence-based policy making, like Rwanda and Zambia, for example. In some countries, the demand side results have pushed the supply side, like Nigeria and Rwanda. And in some countries, a broader national gender equality goals have trickled down into the financial inclusion agendas and prompted the collection of SGDD or supply side in various sectors, including the financial side. So those are examples in Chile and in Mexico. CGAP is working with financial supervisory authorities and also with providers on the supply side of gender disaggregated data. We have also done work for the past 3 years in the WIMO region on digital financial services consumer protection with all key stakeholders. There are important sources of information have been on consumer risk surveys and national surveys to understand the market, especially in countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, and Burkina Faso. But just to give you additional examples, associations, speaking of collaboration, associations can also create tools to better protect consumers, especially women. Just to give you 2 examples, FinTech Indonesia, an association of 370 members, has developed financial consumer protection by creating online tools to combat digital fraud. These include our portal to report suspicious accounts and register and verify personal information. A second example is the Australian Banking Association with like 22 member banks, most of them digital financial service providers that have launched a financial assistant hub. So overall, more robust consumer protection frameworks are needed, and these must be gender sensitive using the demand side, but most importantly, the supply side of gender disaggregated data. So CGAP advocates for a systemic collaborative effort to establish frameworks that align the incentive of various market actors with clear guidance for authorities to collect and use data effectively.
Thank you very much, Sonia, for those examples. And before we go on with the conversation, I'd like to invite our guests today to use the reaction button on Zoom. So if there's something that you like, you could love it, you can agree, you can like it, just because we're online and it always helps with an interactive feeling. So feel free to do that. Before we move on, I wanted to check with Emezino and Dr. Neka, as well as Sonia, to see if you had any comments or thoughts on anything that any of your panelists have said. Is there anything that is catching your ear? Zeno, do you see any potential collaboration based on what Dr. Neka and Sonia have said? So before we go on to the rest of the conversation, I'd love to hear from you.
Yes, so indeed, what Sonia has shared does speak to the fact that collaboration is necessary. And Dr. Neka also mentioned that as well. And, trying to ensure you look at the challenge and you dimension it properly. So awareness creation and the need for you to know how you can make it bespoke for the demand side, how you can make it bespoke, ensuring that the right individuals on the supply side, they know exactly what they need to do. And irrespective of whether it's the demand side or the supply side, you are recognizing the gender intentionality of how you convey the information across. What is the content you're conveying across to equip those who utilize formal financial services to protect themselves and to be aware of what potentially could be efforts by fraudsters to take their resources. So collaborations are really helpful when it comes to even trying to assess the status quo. So when Dr. Neka had mentioned earlier on about not rocking the boat or shaking the table with regard to what's going on the supply side, it's noteworthy to even look at some numbers. Like in the first half of this year, when looking at the report from FITC, one thing which was evident was that you had about 49 employees in Q2 2024 of institutions within the formal financial services space who were culpable. They were involved in defrauding customers on the demand side. And that was an increase from the first quarter of 2024, where you had 35 employees of institutions who were terminated because of participation, looking at the systems of the institutions they worked for, the technology platforms, and exploiting those in order to access funds. So all of this is receiving a lot of attention from the regulator, and the awareness creation that Sonia had spoken to is super critical in ensuring that those who utilize these services, the women who utilize these services, from the moment they are marketed, from the moment the solutions are sold to them, it is at that point you are telling them about consumer protection measures. You are telling them about looking at the fine print. It's being explained to them. In fact, for women, simplicity is extremely key. They are excellent adopters of formal financial services when they really understand the benefit to themselves and their families and, of course, the communities. So it should be simplified. We should discontinue fine print, but make sure that the essentials are very clear upfront so that as they transact, they can enjoy these services and stay protected.
Thank you, Zeno. I think you bring up some very important points. I think when we think about fraud, we often think about some guy in his, in the dark in his computer, defrauding various people, but we never think that fraud, can actually come from the institutions that we've entrusted with our money and with our funds. And you bring up a great point. Women are more vulnerable to these attacks because from a data perspective, from an education perspective, the numbers are quite clear what that shows. So thank you for bringing that up. And I think it's maybe, bank professionals should also do like an oath like they do, in law, to ensure that they respect the work that they're supposed to be doing and the customers that they're supposed to be serving. So Dr. Neka, Sonia, anything from you before I go on?
Yeah, so in terms of collaborative, so definitely after this panel, I will be reaching out, but I see us looking at a couple of areas. So obviously the first would be around tilting more towards the research and insights. We could look at joint research projects where we're conducting studies just to understand. Then even the behavioral studies as well is something else that we can look at. In terms of financial literacy and capacity building, that's another thing that we can look at, see what can we co-create. Then another thing that we really need to also sit down and have, deeper conversation would be around policy advocacy and ecosystem development. And the objective here really would be, seeing how we can start to implement policies that address gender-specific fraud vulnerabilities. So it could be a policy dialogue. We could host roundtables with regulators, the FIs, the digital payment providers, and even coming up with certain gender-sensitive policy recommendations. That's also something that we can sit together, co-create, and come up with. And then, around the strengthening the network of agents, that's something else we could also look at. And then lastly, if the pillar that holds everything together would be tech, and saying to ourselves, okay, what are some conversations that can be had that would help with technology-driven solutions? So things around fraud reporting platforms, do we need to sit down and collaborate with platform designers and ensure that female entrepreneurs are in that space? I mean, there's a whole lot of things that I see us being able to do. And I will definitely circle back to them.
That's great. I'm going to hold you all to these promises of collaboration and further partnership. Sonia, would you like to add anything before we move on?
Yes, just to quickly add, I see, for example, within the value chain for provision of services to women varies, will continue changing, enabled by technology, but also I see common factors. When I was listening to Zeno and Dr. Neka in terms of like how the weak the link of the agents could be in some cases because of women's lack of education or like because of like women behavior, and they feel like they need to share their PIN numbers or they need more help to understand the USDD interfaces of these systems. That's a global trend that happens in Latin America, that happens in Asia, that happens in Africa. And another point that I wanted to emphasize is I couldn't emphasize more the need for data. Data will allow us both on the demand and the supply side to be able to have visibility, to understand, to analyze, and also to make informed policies, products, and see what women are different. Even when we use AI, machine learning models, if we don't use the right data, those systems will be biased from the beginning because they will be blind to understand women's different patterns, women's different behaviors.
Absolutely. And I might also add to that as we want to be seeing more disaggregated data and we want more gender-specific products, we also need to have more women in decision-making positions, right? More women as account officers or as even, marketing officers or marketing heads in these institutions that can specifically create products for women. So I love that. Thank you all for picking up on each other's points. We have about 20 minutes left in this wonderful conversation that we're having, and I would like to leave some time for questions. I do want to just ask one last question to each and every one of you. And I would like you to, take some time to answer this. And it's essentially what we call a magic wand question. So each panelist, if you could please think about some actionable steps or recommendations to better protect women from fraud within digital payments. So this could imagine you had a magic wand and you could say, this is what I would like to happen within the fraud and as it pertains to women and disaggregated data. So Zeno, as the only gentleman on this panel, if you had a magic wand, which is rare, by the way, so we're happy that this setup is this way. If you had a magic wand, what would you do?
Thank you very much, Lily. So basically, there are actions that need to be taken by the public sector and by the private sector. Now, on the public sector front, collaborations around having the right policies in place that would mandate that entities on the supply side, as I had said earlier, they ensure there is education about protecting yourself as a consumer at the point of presenting a financial solution to any woman customer, whether it is savings, credit, insurance, pensions, investments, or payments. It needs to be clear to the user of that solution what potential risks could arise so that whenever there is any issue that comes up, with that policy in place, with that mandate in place, the private sector institutions that interface directly with the women can ensure that that value is given to the women. Very important to sustain trust of women who use these solutions is having a strong, robust, dependable, reliable conflict resolution system. Because if you're able to let the woman know that you can have access to this safe savings proposition And this is how you protect yourself and your funds as you save towards a goal for the benefit of your family, your business. Whenever issues come up, maybe there is a challenge with the platform, maybe there is a failed payment transaction, because there is a thin line between failed transaction and fraud, especially from the perspective of the woman on the demand side. So it's important that when there is a mechanism, there's a point that you can reach out to make a complaint, that the resolution occurs within the 24-hour promise, if that's the promise, or whatever turnaround time is indicated. Because in our interactions with women, we know that word of mouth is very important within social circles. If the experience is bad and the fraud is not resolved, and there is no resolution to that complaint, then you're going to lose patronage completely, and other people are going to hear about it within the circles of the women. So on the public sector side, having policies that would motivate the private sector players to ensure that there is good conflict resolution and there is awareness on the part of the women on how to protect themselves. Then on the private sector side, it's very important that they follow through on what Sonia had earlier mentioned, which is gender-disaggregated data. It's important that there is a recognition that women are not a homogeneous group. Within women, you have different clusters, and each cluster has a unique way you would interact with them in order for them to come onto formal financial services. So that recognition should inform how solutions are tailor-made. And I'll leave with 5 C's. The 5 C's to bear in mind while ensuring that women are taken care of, are protected, and you're able to avert fraud instances are cognizance, which is the literacy piece. The second one is capability, which is what we've been talking about, ensuring they understand how to use solutions, including the conflict resolution piece. Then conviction will come up, which is the trust, then confidence, and then comfort, because we want them to get very acclimatized to formal financial services and also spread the word about that. So those are key things that need to be in place. And from an infrastructure perspective, we need more women agents out there. We have just about 26.5% of about 2 million agents in the country based on what we found in our interaction with different stakeholders and the survey we carry out. And especially because of social norms in certain parts of the country, where you have women agents, they will be able to get more women to participate in formal financial services. There will be vehicles to educate these women about how to protect yourself, what is not shareable with regard to your personal data. And in that way, we would see an uptick and more safety with regard to use of digital financial services, solutions, and processes.
Zio, that's excellently said. I think you've definitely covered all the aspects that one could potentially think of. I would like to give, you talked about something very important. It's, let's say a woman has a failed transaction. It's paramount that that institution resolves it in the time that they said they would. And I think this is where companies like MoneyPoint deserve a shout out, because they figured out the pain points of the end user, which was, I'll give you an example. Let's say I take an Uber, once a day. And sometimes I pay with a transfer, other times I pay with my card. But I remember before MoneyPoint came to the scene, Uber drivers would often ask you to wait in the car until they have received the payment, because a lot of these transactions tend to fail. But now with MoneyPoint, quite literally, you send the money over. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Nigerian way of payments, we actually have really robust bank apps that allow us to do real-time payments. But MoneyPoint allows the end user to receive an alert immediately. So there's no network issues with MoneyPoint. So that then puts them at ease. So I think, like you rightly said, we need more private sector initiatives like MoneyPoint that really speak to the pain points of the end user. So thank you so very much, Dino, for that. Sonia, so what would be your magic wand recommendations?
Yes, and just to like build up a little bit on that last part of the recourse mechanisms and the consumer protection side, I think they need to be frictionless. They need to be easy to use, but also understand the different languages that women talk. It's not just like one language, especially in Africa, in Latin America. So those customer supports need to accommodate the specific needs of women. So the magic one, I wish I had one, but let me put it in perspective. I will continue emphasizing on the importance of data. CGAP advocates for the collection and use of gender-disaggregated data to promote women's financial inclusion and agency. Our research underscores the necessity of integrating gender-disaggregated data into fraud detection systems to effectively address and mitigate fraud risks. And when we're talking about data, we're talking about data that has two elements. It's useful and it's impactful, meaning that that data is reliable, is high quality data, it's comparable, it's cost effective, and it's relevant. That's the key with data. CGAP emphasizes that GDD, or gender disaggregated data, is crucial for designing strategies and interventions. If we cannot understand it, we won't be able to take measures upon that. Those interventions will help increase women's use of financial services, but also empower them to be stronger market players, because we are strong market players. This data enables financial institutions also to understand and address the unique risks that women face in digital finance and the unique behavior and patterns that we have by country and regionally. Policies also must be informed by high-quality gender-disaggregated data. Gender-disaggregated data from both the demand and the supply side of the market, and financial supervisory authorities. Zeno, for example, was talking about the need for policies. Financial supervisory authorities are well-positioned to drive the collection and use of GDD to assess the financial gender gap, inform gender inclusion strategies and policies, and monitor progress. Overall, gender data is also essential for providers, for financial institutions to understand the market opportunity for serving women and build strong business cases for designing products and services tailored to us for women's robust patterns and behaviors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Very valid points you made. So, Dr. Neka, what would be your magic wand recommendations?
So my magic wand recommendations, I would use an acronym for that, and it would be creating something called SAFER. So making it safer for the women, so securing access and financial empowerment for residents. And essentially, this acronym takes into consideration a lot of things that Sonia and Zeno have spoken about, where the S is for secure tools and technologies. You just shared something about MoneyPoint and great things that they're doing. We need to ensure that in my magic wand, we'd ensure that with all the fintechs, all the companies coming out, all the startups, it's more secure. The tools and technologies are more secure. Now, for me, the A, so SAFER is SAFER. The A is awareness and advocacy. And awareness and advocacy, we cannot emphasize that enough. When she knows, she's more likely to protect herself. So whether we like it or not, all hands have to be on deck. And for this awareness and advocacy, it's a collaborative approach that we're having. Now, the F, Zeno spoke a lot about that, and that's the fraud prevention policies. Okay, so Zeno talked, significantly a lot about policies. So I'm not going to talk about that, but for the E, is for education and empowerment. And here, because we're dealing with women and we know how women are, we need to start to create a culture of empowerment. And what do I mean by that? So under this, I'm talking about confidence building campaigns where we're able to foster a mindset shift, where as a woman, I feel empowered to adopt financial tools without feeling that I'm going to be exploited. Here, I'm talking about having things like a digital heroes program where women are celebrated, female entrepreneurs are celebrated who successfully have thwarted fraud attempts, thereby inspiring others to build resilience. I'm talking about things as simple as a global advocacy day, where we dedicate annual global campaigns to raise awareness about women's digital financial security. Okay, so that, for me, the E is so important. And then lastly, the R, the resilient community support. That's so important. As women, we learn through communities. We do a lot through communities. We are the essence of the community, and we need to start thinking this resilient community support. How can we have more of that in the ecosystem? So for me, that would be my magic wand, ensuring that it's possible to create something that I would call safer, securing access and financial empowerment for resilience. So secure tools and technology, awareness and advocacy, fraud prevention policies, education and empowerment, resilient community support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Neka. It shows that you are someone who educates for a living. I love that. Safer, very, very nice. Great. So we've come to the portion of the session where we'll be taking Q&A. We have some questions coming up, and I'd also like to invite our guests today. If they want to come off mute, feel free to do so. But let me start with a question that we have from our audience. We've all spoken about how do we make women feel safe within these ecosystems. The question is, when we think of technology for women, how do we feel tech can solve for fraud with women in mind? I think that's a great question. We've touched on that a little bit, but do we have any specific ways that we feel like tech can solve for fraud with women in mind? And that's open to anyone to answer, any of the panelists. Okay, I'll assign that to Zeno. How can tech make women feel safer?
I think Dr. Neka's trying to speak, Lele.
Okay, Dr. Neka, please go ahead. But you're on mute.
So I can unmute now. So just thinking, I'm just thinking back to the acronym I'm talking about, tech. Probably from a design perspective. So maybe if we're looking at how tech can solve fraud with women in mind, could we look at designing gender-sensitive digital solutions? Could we have platforms that are simpler, probably more intuitive user interfaces that considers that as women, there are varying levels of digital literacy? That would be one. Another one would be, could we look at maybe incorporating, so I'm no tech, I don't know, incorporating multilingual or visual prompts for clarity, especially for those that are in the underserved communities. We tend to leave them out. Yeah, so I think obviously maybe enhancing more around authentication. What are some things that can be done there? So can they leverage more, around the biometric verification process? Yeah, and then maybe lastly, and I'm saying this now because one of my mentees was a victim of fraud. And I'm just thinking now that maybe if we had like multi-layered context-based authentication. So taking into perspective specifically two things, the transaction history, of course, but location. Just off the top of my head, I'm thinking they probably need to have a roundtable to delve into those matters more. But yeah, off the top of my head, I'm thinking that could work.
Absolutely. I just think about the times that I've traveled and used my Nigerian dollar card. I don't think anyone has ever called me to ask me like, oh, is this you in Spain, right? So I think that's a really great point. We do have some other questions here. Zeno, what are the challenges of getting gender disaggregated data, if any? Like what are the challenges that you have encountered?
Oh,
You're on mute. Thank you.
yes. So, very good question. Whenever we carry out our survey, there are certain barriers that we've encountered, and one of them is the unwillingness of individuals we interview to share information around household income. Even prior to that, trying to understand, what's the population of women within a certain region where we are carrying out a survey. We work closely with the National Bureau of Statistics to be able to ensure that the data ultimately is refined, and when extrapolated across the country, it is representative. But the reality of inaccessible locations because of security concerns and also because of certain norms, that's something that may not enable us to be 100% accurate in determining, for example, how many women are in certain households in certain locations. But we get pretty close because the survey typically has a sample size of nothing less than 27,000 people across the country. Every single state is represented. So we get pretty close. But that's one barrier that we always encounter. And then the one I earlier mentioned, when you do get access to the home, you are not able to get very accurate information regarding income when you interact with the women, when our interviewers who are women interact with the women in the households, particularly because in the norms associated with that location, all the money goes through the man. He spends it, and she is not aware. So that's a challenge. And then there is also lethargy as one other thing we've encountered. The lethargy is we carry out our survey once every 2 years, and the people you speak to in 2021 or 2020, they expect that they have been heard and changes will occur within the country, and then you return to them 2 years later and ask them similar questions, and they're kind of tired of being part of the process because they've not really seen the kind of change. So it's a call to action for all the stakeholders to take this feedback, re-engineer the systems, not only the solutions, but also the process through which the women interact with these solutions, to streamline it, to simplify it, so that when we go back to them and we're trying to get gender-disaggregated data, they'll be more responsive, recognizing that their feedback has imputed into something that has changed and now works for them because it's designed for the women.
Thank you so much, Zeno. We have come to the close of our session. So I'd like to, on behalf of myself and AIR, thank you to our wonderful panelists, Sonia, Dr. Neka, and Emezino, for joining us and sharing their insights. If you could please take a look at the screen and kindly scan the QR code. We look forward to taking many of these points raised today and for the rest of the week to the policymakers at the in-person policy sprint, which will take place in Q1 of 2025. I'd like to invite Victoria Jory, who is the engagement lead at AIR, to tell us more about it. Again, my name is Lele Balde Cameron, and it's been a pleasure taking you through this wonderful panel session. Thank you.
Thank you, Lele. What an incredible moderator you are. We really appreciate all of your time, and it's so wonderful to see new and old friends here today. So the QR code on the screen is just telling you the agenda for the rest of the week. Of course, I really want to thank all of our partners. I mean, the panelists, special thanks today, but we've got all these wonderful partners that are bolstering us and helping us to make these conversations happen. AIR does plan on doing an in-person policy sprint. It will be closed door and it will be for regulators, and hopefully we'll make that happen in H1 of next year. So watch this space, but please join us for the rest of the week. I know Friday will be exciting in the demo days when they will come with their solutions. The tech sprinters are busy working away while we're having a lovely conversation. They're busy trying to find solutions for some of these problems. So thank you all again. Have a wonderful day ahead and a great week. Take care, everyone.